Ugh, I'm going to need some help with this one. Free instant delivery?
Help has arrived. I will name you Bubbles. Our own custom framework, of course.
What's up, everyone? In this video, we are going to code our own PHP model view controller, MVC for short, framework from scratch. Our framework is not going to have all the bells and whistles of the major frameworks, but it will get the job done, and hopefully give you an idea of how they're structured and how they generally work. By the end of this video, we are obviously going to have our own framework. I'm also going to include an example model view and controller so you can see how the framework works and how to build your own site off of this framework. I'm going to name the framework IR Coding. Here we are looking at our example view, which is called in our controller up in the URL. We have the root of our directory ircoding_done / the controller / the function in that controller. Now for the file structure, we're going to have our htaccess file, which is basically going to route everything through our index file. Our index file is then going to use our framework, which is housed inside of our core folder. In here we have 5 classes: the autoloader, the controller, database, model, and the router, taking care of everything from autoloading all the files we need, to the database handling, to the model for getting data, and the router, which basically determines where the user is going to be sent based on what they put in the URL. And the site that the user decides to create is housed inside of the app folder. Here's where you put all of your site-specific stuff. In the case of an update to the IR coding framework, all you have to do is check out the latest release on GitHub and replace the core folder. Inside the applications folder, here's where we have our assets, our controllers, our models, and our views. The assets folder is anything relating to your application. Any CSS you might have, any images or JavaScript, or whatever else it may be. The controllers, models, and the views folder are also things specific to your app. You create your own controllers, your own models, and your views where your HTML is going to live. The controllers grab the data from the models, and then the controller passes that data into the views for displaying to the end user. And our core folder is going to take care of autoloading these things for us. So our main focus is going to be our core folder. That's the framework that we're going to be coding. I'm going to begin by creating an IR coding folder inside of my www directory. Then I'm going to create my htaccess file, and we're going to open that in Sublime. Our first line is options-indexes. What this does is it says that a user who hits a directory on our web server will not be able to see a list of the files in the directory. Then we're going to turn the rear engine on. This will allow us to pass along the URL to our index.php file. Before we do that, we want to add a few conditions. These conditions right here say rewrite the URL only if the file or directory in the URL does not exist. Say we're trying to load a CSS file. We don't want to pass that CSS file through our index and try to route it to a controller and a function. We just want to load the CSS file. So if the file and the directory do not exist, then we're going to pass along the URL to our index.php file. And that is our htaccess file. Back in our folder, we're going to create our index.php file. Open it in Sublime. The very top of our PHP file is where we're going to write a bunch of global defines. First one being the type of environment we are in. Next, we're going to define our protocol. We're going to check if we have HTTPS, then we know we're using HTTPS. Otherwise, we're on HTTP. With those things in mind, we can create our base URL. Our base URL is our protocol that we just defined right here, plus our server host, and then the directory name that we are currently in. After our base URL, we're going to define our base URL assets. It's easier to have it defined for the base URL assets instead of having to type out baseurl.app/assets every time you have to access a file in the assets folder. Now we can write our first if statement. Our first if statement is going to check the environment variable. In development mode, we want to have our errors displayed. To do that, we put error reporting to -1, and we set our display errors to 1. Else, we know we're in production. And in that case, we don't want to display any errors. Then we're going to define our use database. This basically says connect to database or don't connect to the database. We're going to begin with it as false, so we're not using any database connection. Later on, I'll show you guys how to set this true, connect to the database, and get some data out of that database. Now we're going to require our first file, our autoloader. Now it's time to create our core folder. Inside of our core folder, we're going to create an autoloader.php file. Before we start coding the autoloader, we are going to have some autoloader parameters. Into our autoloader, we're going to pass our database credentials. Here's where our define use database is going to come into play. We're going to say load use database. Then we're going to specify a creds array. Our host for the database, the username, password, and the database name itself. With the param set, we can create our autoloader, and in we pass our autoloader params. Now in our autoloader.php, we want to create the autoloader class. First thing in this class is going to be our private folders variable. This array is going to hold all folders that you want to autoload. First one being our core folder. Any files we place in here, which will have the router, the controller, the database, and so on, they'll all get autoloaded. Then we want to autoload things from the app folder. We want to autoload the controllers and the models. Any controllers the users create or any models they create will be autoloaded. Back in our IR coding folder, it's time to create our app folder. This is where app-specific things get placed. Inside of our app folder, we have our controllers, our models, our views, and our assets. We have our folders for autoloading. The next thing we're going to store is the models we have loaded. By default, we're always going to load the model in our core folder, which we'll create in a minute, along with any models from our app folder will also get appended onto this array as they get loaded. Then we're going to also save our database in our autoloader. Now we're going to create our construct function, which runs when this line is hit right here in our index file. Pass in our parameters, which we're going to make optional. By default, it will be an empty array. First, we want to do a for each over the folders that we just defined. We're looping over our private variable folders right here. On each folder, we're going to define a function called autoloadFolderFiles, and in we're going to pass the folder to be autoloaded, which just contains the name of the folder. Under our construct function, we will define our autoloadFolderFiles. The first thing we want to do in this function is define our path to the folder. Here we're getting the directory, we're doing a dot backslash on it, and then the folder name, and we're appending a slash onto it. In this case here, it'd be core. It'd be app controllers, and it would be models. Now that we have the path to folder, we can get the files from that folder. This way we can loop over all the files and auto-load them. If we're looping over the folders, we're not trying to do anything with the dot or the dot folder names when we get the scan directory function. And we simply want to require once the path to folder dot folder file. Now we do have our loaded models up here that we want to store. So we're going to say if app/models equals the folder name, then we want to append on to this loaded models. What we want to append on is the file name. We're going to use the path info of the folder file and just get the file name. We don't want the .php on there. Now, along with requiring every file inside of all the folders we want autoloaded, we have also stored the models that we have loaded in our loaded models array. For later use in a couple of the other classes, I'm going to create a function called getLoadedModels. Simply going to return the loaded models, and I'm going to create our getDatabase, which is going to return the database, which we actually forgot to set. And we want to set that after we've loaded all our files. But we only want to set our database if we want to use a database, which is passed in right here. Here I'm going to say if we have params database load set and it's true, then we're going to load our database. This will create a new database class for us, which we have to create over here in our core folder. Create a database file, open that up in Sublime, and we will come back to our database class later. Right now we have it set to false, so we don't need to worry about it. With our files autoloaded, we can now route the user to the correct function in the correct controller based on the URL. We're going to create some params for our router and then load the router. Two parameters here are going to be our default controller and our default method. With those set, we can create our new router. Before I create the router, I'm going to go ahead and create my default controller. Over in my app controllers, I'm going to create my ircoding.php controller. Open it up in Sublime. And we want to extend this off of our default controller class. Right now I'm just going to do a public index function. I'm going to say die. So our default controller is set up. We will create our controller file in just a second inside of our core folder, because all classes that we create will extend off of our core controller class. Back in our core folder, create a router.php and open it up in Sublime. And we'll begin by defining our class router. First thing we want to specify is our controller. The router always needs to know which controller to send the user to. Then we want to define the method. Lastly, we want to define any params we might send along to the controller and the method. Now we can define our construct function, and we're going to pass in the params when we hit our line right here in our index file. Router params will be passed in right here. First thing in our construct function is updating our server request URI. Here we're getting the directory that we're currently coding in, which is IR coding, and we're replacing everything before that. So we are always guaranteed the request URI to start at the current folder we're in. Basically, we're always going to have the request URI start with the folder we're coding in our root directory, which is IR coding. The way the router is going to work is the very first element of the string is going to be the directory name. The second element is the controller, the third element is the method, and after that's going to be the parameters. We can just see what is happening here. We're going to print some stuff out as we go along. We refresh our page, our server request URI is IR coding /. This line right here is always ensuring that whatever root directory we are in for our core folder is always the base of our request URI. Then we're going to check for any get variables that might exist. So we're going to explode the request URI on our question mark. We'll print out our request URI pieces. See, we exploded on question mark. There's no question mark here though, so we just get the first element, which is IR coding. Now if I do test 1, 2, 3, 4, you see it's split on the question mark, and the first is our first get variable. And what we want to do is set the query string to always be whatever is after the question mark. So if we add just some other random get variable on there, you see the first element in this array is still everything after the question mark in our request URI. We're going to check for a request URI pieces 1. If it exists, then we'll use that as the query string. Otherwise, we'll set it to nothing. Here we parse our string, our query string, which we just set right here, to the get array. Print our get. You see our first element in our exploded array has now been set to our get array. I'm going to remove these print our statements here. We just echo here though. Now parse our URI string. Now we can do an array filter, and we're going to explode our server request URI right here on /. Now we're actually looking for the MVC path. Now we're going to loop over each of these pieces. We're going to get the pieces of the MVC path piece exploded on the question mark, and anything after the question mark we do not want because we've already set this in our get variable. So we're always just going to take the very first piece that comes out. After we have removed question marks and anything after them from each of the pieces, then we're going to rekey the array and filter it, removing any empty values from that array. Now we should see our first array having both the IR coding and the get variables, and then this one should just have the IR coding. There we go. We successfully removed get variables from our URI pieces. Now that our URI string pieces are up to date, we can finally moving on to set the controller. So we're going to create our own setController method, and we're going to pass along the URI string piece we want to set the router controller to. We're going to check if this is set, the URI string piece is 1, and if it is, we're going to set the controller to that. Otherwise, we're going to use a default controller. As you noticed here, we did not specify a controller. In this case, we want the default controller to take precedence, because this is just the folder. Create our setController, which just sets the router's controller to whatever we pass in. Just dump out the router here, which is just this. Our controller is set to IR coding. By not passing along any controller in the URL, we get sent to the default controller. If I pass along test controller, now the controller is set to test. Now the same principle for the method. Under the setController, we're going to do a set method. This time we're checking for the second piece in the URI. If it exists, we're going to use it, otherwise we're going to use the default method. Then we're going to create our set method function, which just sets the method, and let's look at our router. Now you see it's defaulting to the index. So if I do test/go, now the method is set to go. Now it will route us to our controller test and the method go in that controller. After the method has been set, we're going to unset all our URI string pieces 0, 1, and 2. Folder, controller, and the method. Anything that's left after that will just be our parameters, which we are going to save to our params. If we do a /controller/method/ another something, anything after the method is just going to be considered parameters passed in as parameters to the method that we specify. Back to our IR coding, and I specify a 22. You see our parameters now has a 22 that will get passed along as a parameter to that function. At the bottom here, for later use, I'm just going to add the get methods along with our set methods here for our controller and our method. we have one thing left in our index file to do, and that is call our router/go method. This will actually send the user to the specified controller and method. Inside of our go method, we're going to pass in our autoloader, which was created up here. After our construct function, I'm going to define our go method. Here's where we're going to get the controller and our method. With that, we can create a new controller. And in that controller, we're going to pass in the autoloader. Here, our controller is a new controller. It's a variable because it's going to be whatever we have received from our getController function. Then all we have to do is call our userfunc array. We're going to pass our controller and our method, and then we're going to pass in this params. These are the params that we dumped out up here. This function is nice because it takes in a variable of params and just passes them in no matter how many you have. If you have one, it'll pass one parameter to the method that you're calling. If you pass in 5, it'll break up the params array and pass in 5 parameters to that method. And that's our router. Now we can move on to our core controller. Over in our core folder, create a controller.php file. We're going to define our controller class. Our controller class is going to get called every time we do a new controller right here. Into that controller, we're going to pass in our autoloader. So our construct function is going to look like this. The only thing we want to do here is loop over our loaded models. Here we're calling our autoloader function getLoadedModels. And we want to do this so that every controller we're in, we can access the models by just simply typing this and then the model name, and then any function you want in the model. That's why we want to loop over each of the loaded models and load them to the controller. So here we're going to get the model name, which is the loaded model, model underscore name, and then we want to instantiate the model name variable to this controller. Now I've created the model inside of the controller and given it a variable name of its model name. Now that we're instantiating our model right here, we have to actually create the core model. Back to our core folder, create our last class model. Since we're passing our autoloader into the model, we're going to save it as autoloader. We're also going to save our database. And of course, when we instantiate our model inside of our controller, we are going to hit the construct function and pass in our autoloader. The first thing we want to do is save the autoloader. Then we want to save our database. And our database comes from our autoloader in our getDatabase function right here, which returns the database. Now anywhere in any function in any model, since everything extends the model, you can always call this database, then any function. That's our model. Back in our IR coding class that we did that extends our controller, we have the die here. Let's do IR here. In our browser, if we go to localhost IR coding, we should see IR here, and we do. Why? Because we went to IR coding, we didn't specify a controller or a method, and so it defaulted to the IR coding index function. Just to test this out, we can do a view here, iView. Now, if we do IR coding / view, we get to the view method. Let's say we want to pass in a variable. Let's do 22, and then we also want to do a get variable. Test equals 1, 2, 3, var1, and we add that here. We should see 22 appear for var1, and let's do our get variable test. Refresh our page. Our MVC, our model view controller, routes correctly. It checks for variables with slash, or if you still want to use the old get method, you can do that as well. Now I'm going to show you guys how to use this framework to code a model view and controller of your own inside of the app folder. Actually use the framework. We've already created our class IR coding. Now let's create our model. App model, create a model.php, and we're going to name it IR coding model. We will define our model. Now it is important to note that the way this framework is coded, this model has to be named the same as the file name, and when you're calling it from, say, inside of a controller like our IR coding controller, the index, you would do this IR coding model because the autoloader has loaded the model for us into this controller right here in our core controller. IR coding extends our core controller. It has loaded all of the models we need into our controller, just like this. Now we have access to the IR coding model, just like this, and any function we define there can be just called like that. We have our model and we have our controller. Over to our controller, we're going to define our data, HTML, This will be the title for our HTML page. Then we'll define our page. Here we're going to call our model, which has two extends, our core model. Inside of that model, we're going to say getPageText. Here we're going to return the text based on if we're using a database or not. Right now we're not using the database, so we won't be hitting a database. Use database, then get text from database, otherwise get text from code. And we're simply returning an array of text here because we're not getting anything from the database. We're going to have a title, a subtitle, and a description. We're going to make this into our page info, and that will be its own array because we also want to have a few links on our page. Our links is just another array. Each array is a link title and the link URL. Make sure when everything's working, print out our data. Localhost IR coding, default controller, default method. We're getting our data from our model. HTML title page, there's our info and our links. Now we're going to get a snippet of HTML for our description. Here we specify the HTML snippet we want to get back. We're going to pass along our data array to that view. In our app views, we're going to create a folder for our IR coding controller. There's our folder, and inside that we're going to create our snippet HTML description. We're also going to create our HTML template. This is going to hold the actual HTML structure, the HTML, the title, and the body tags. Go ahead and open up those as well. Our description, and there's our HTML template. Our getViewHtml for our description is right here. And for now, we're going to do description, and we'll style that up later. Now in our model, we have to define our getViewHtml core model. GetViewHtml, we take in the view file and the data. The view file is going to look into the folder we specify starting inside of our views folder. First thing we're going to do is we're going to extract our data. This converts every array key inside of our data into its own variable. Then we're going to do an OB start, output buffer start, so we're not actually writing the HTML out to the page. Then we want to actually require the view file. In our case, apps, views, then whatever path to the view file we specify, .php. In our case, snippets HTML description .php. And then all we have to do is get it from the output buffer. Anything in our data array that we've passed in is now a variable inside of our view file that we've just required, and we return that as HTML from our function. So that's how you get a snippet of HTML, pass along some data, and get the HTML as a string. Now all you have to do is echo out the description HTML variable in our body. The last thing we want to do is load our view. Here we want to load the whole view, which is going to be our HTML template. And we want to, of course, pass along all the data that we've defined up until this point. And this is going to be defined in our core controller, because this is going to be a function used by every single controller created inside the app folder in order to load a single view. Load view. We take in the view file, we take in the data, extract the data, then we want to require the view file. Apps views HTML template. Inside of our HTML template, we have our default HTML, like I said. The first thing we're going to do is do the title. The title's coming from our IR coding controller. Right here, the HTML title, IR coding. The extract method in our controller extracts the data so that the keys inside of the data turn into variables. That's why in the view we can call it $HTML title instead of data HTML title. We're also going to make sure that this is safe by escaping our HTML. Always want to escape the HTML so nobody can do any kind of JavaScript injections on you. We're going to escape our HTML inside of our controller. Function is going to look something like this. It's going to take in a string and it's just going to return the model escapeHtml string, which is a function that we define inside of our model, which is HTML entities. This escape HTML is just to be on the safe side so that nobody can inject any HTML or JavaScript on your page. The next thing I'm going to do is hop over to my app assets folder. I'm going to create my images folder for my awesome logos. I've created a favicon and I've created a logo that is 50 by 50. Now that we have those inside of our assets images folder, I'm going to go ahead and include them here. First, we're going to get the favicon right there, link, shortcut icon, and then an href. And here we're using our base URL assets defined that we did in our index file. Here is our base URL app/assets that I'm taking on my favicon.ico. Refresh my page, you see I have my little icon up there right next to the title of my page, IR coding. Then I'm going to include some meta stuff for the character set and the viewport. Then I'm going to include some fonts from Google, specifically the Ubuntu font. After that, in our head, I'm going to go ahead and use some jQuery because I like jQuery. After we have those outsiders included, we're going to move on to including our own CSS and JavaScript. Back in our app folder, assets, we're going to create a folder for CSS and for JavaScript. Inside of our CSS folder, we're going to create an IR coding folder. In here, I'm going to create 3 files, one for mobile, PC, and then global. Back up to my JavaScript folder. And in here, we're going to create a folder. We're going to call it IR coding. Inside here, we're going to create ourselves a global.js file. That will be all the JavaScript we need for our IR coding HTML template. In our HTML template, we're going to include our global.css file, base URL assets, then we got the CSS, IR coding, and the global.css. Then I'm going to include our pc.css file. This only gets included if you see here I have the media screen and mid width set to 1400 pixels. For mobile, we're going to say max with 1400 pixels. So anytime you're under 1400 pixels, you get the mobile experience. Last thing we want to include here is our JavaScript file. Again, base URL assets gets us into our assets folder, and then our JS folder, IR coding, global.js. And that concludes the head for our HTML template. First div inside of our body is going to be our main container div, and it's going to be called site container. For our PC, our desktop view, we're going to go to max with the 1400, center the text, and bump it down from the top 200 pixels. For mobile, we're just going to bump it down 50 pixels, give it some padding left, right, and make the text in the center. Then what we want to do is include our awesome logo that we created, our logo 50 by 50 .png coming from our assets folder. Over in our global.css file, we're going to create some files for some of the HTML tags. We got our A tag here. It got a hover, make it underline, background dark on the body. Font family is Ubuntu from our Google Fonts include that we did in the head. And then we're setting up the H1 and the H3 for headings. After our image, we want to give ourselves the heading H1. Here, we're going to echo out. Again, we're going to escape the HTML, and we're going to do page info title. This is coming from our model info title, IR coding. Under our H1 tag, we want to define a section, and in this section, we're going to echo out the subtitle. Over in our global.css, we're going to give this a margin top and a margin bottom. We're also going to wrap this in an H3 tag, so it's a little smaller than the H1. Then comes our description HTML, which is our snippet, which we defined back in our controller right here, and we got it from our getViewHtml inside of our model. Here, inside of our little snippet, we're going to create some HTML. We're going to use our section container plus info text container, and for our desktop view, we're going to give it little different styles compared to our mobile. Main difference being the width. We're going to set the width on the desktop, but not on the mobile. Also for our mobile, we're going to make our H1 and H3 tags a little smaller than they are normally. Inside our snippet, continuing on with our description, we're going to call this info text heading bar. We're going to give this some global styles. We're also going to style up our toggle, which is when you click on the show hide, and that will be right inside of our snippet here after we display out the page info title, and then defining our div info text toggle. Start out as hide, and if you click on the hide, it's going to change to show. It's going to display a description, hide a description. Underneath the heading bar, we want to display the actual description. We're going to echo out and escape our page info description. It's going to wrap up our description snippet. Might be a good time just to make sure our site is working. Head over to IR coding. Looks like we're up and running. Got our logo, title, subtitle, and our text. After our description, we need to do a for each loop over our links. Inside of each of our links, we're going to do a section container class on it, and we're going to put an A tag on it. So in our model here, our links are going to have a link title and a link URL. Paste the link URL inside of the href. Target blank, so it opens up in a new window. Refresh our page, and we have our links. Over in my global.js file that I opened, I'm going to create an IR coding. Inside this object, I'm going to create one function called initialize. First thing I'm going to do is console log this, so we make sure that we know this is working. Then right below this, we'll do a function for the document.ready. I call ircoding.initialize. When we refresh our page here, we should see IR coding in the console. There it is. After our console log, we're going to do an on-click for our toggle. Over in our description snippet, info text toggle. Check for it being visible first, and if it's visible, we're going to hide it. We're hiding the text, the info text, which is the description. Then we're going to change the text to show. For the else, we want to do the opposite. Show, and we want to change this to hide. Refresh our page. When we click on the hide, it should hide the description, and it does. We click show, it should show the description. There we go. Simple front end MVC, showing you guys how to use this framework, complete. Now the last thing I'm going to show you guys how to do is hook up a database using this framework. So we're going to code up our own database class. First thing you need to do is import the SQL file from this repository. The link will be in the description to GitHub, and it should look something like this. We got a templates table and a templates links table. The template table just has, our title, subtitle, and description, the same stuff on the landing page. It's just going to be coming from a database now. The other table is our links table, our YouTube and our GitHub link right here. And then they correspond to a template. Back to our index file, we're going to change our useDatabase to be true. Now that we're using true for our database, we actually have to specify the correct credentials in here. I'm on localhost. Username is root for local box, WAMP, no password, and our database is called IR coding. So we're going to create our database class, and we're going to have some constants up here. Now keep in mind, this is going to be a PDO database helper. First two constants are just the type of fetch we want to get back. We want a single array or a multi-dimensional array back from our PDO request. Then we're going to have a private variable for our connection to the database, a private variable for our execution params, a fetch type, which will store one of these two, depending on whatever you specify in your own model, SQL, which is the string that we're going to be passing, table name, the table name you're querying against. This is going to be an array. Same for the join, it's going to be an array. The last variable is our orderBy. First thing we're going to do is define our construct, and we're going to pass in our database. This happens in our Autoloader. Here we create a new database and we pass in our database and the creds. We're basically getting the database creds, everything we need to connect to the database. What we want to do is a try catch here. If we don't connect, we're going to dump out the message and just die. Otherwise, we want to set our connection. New PDO. First parameter for PDO is the string. We specify the MySQL, and then the host. Then we want to pass along the username. And of course, we need a password. That's how we create a new PDO connection. Then we're going to set the error mode for our connection. And after that, we're going to call an initialize function. Our initialize function is going to be a private function. It's going to initialize all of these variables up here. We're going to set everything pretty much to an empty string or an empty array. This way we have a fresh start. So every time I make a database call, we call initialize after we're done with it, so it's all set for the next call. Now I'm going to create a function for setting the table. This table name equals table name. Then I'm going to create a function for setting the where. Parameters here are going to be column, value, and type. Since the where is an array, we're going to add on to it. Now we can call this as many times as we want from our model, where this column equals this value, and this is the type of where. OrderBy is very similar, but we only take in a column and a direction. OrderBy is also an array. Save the column and the direction. Then we have the join, which is similar to the where as well. This is going to take in the type of join, the table string, and the onString. So we add on to our join variable, the type, table string, and the onString type. This is the table to join on. This is the on. Then we have our set fetch. This allows you to specify the fetch type. We're back to the IR coding model. Now we have database true, so we want to get page text from the database. Create that function right here. First thing we're going to define is our select. This is going to be a string. First thing we want is templates. .star. We want to get everything from the templates. Then from the template links, we want to get the title as link title and the URL as link URL. Then, because we have our database model now, we can say this database table. We're calling our database table function right here, and we're setting the table name for our statement. For this one, we want to specify templates. Then we're going to add on a join, calling our database join right here, type table string onString, left join, template links, where template links.templateID equals templates ID. We're going to get a template along with all of the template links for the template ID. Then we're going to set our where clause. We just want one template back, which is template ID of 1. This database where templates.id is 1. Then an order by statement where template links.title is ascending. We're sorting the template links we get back in ascending order. Then I'm going to set the fetch to multi because we want to get back multiple rows. Then run my select query and get back some data. In my database class, I'm going to do my runSelectQuery, and we're going to pass in the select string. Now this is the PDO select string. right? And it's going to default to star. First thing we want to do is initialize our SQL. So we do select, and whatever you passed in as a select string from this table name, which was set right here, templates. Then we want to run a build join function. So our build join function is going to loop over whatever we have set, if we have anything set for our join variable. For each of these, we're going to append onto the SQL, make the join type upper, join, and the table to join, and then on. In our case here is template links.templateID equals templates ID. Then we need to build our where. Our where is also an array. We begin out by saying SQL.equals where, and then loop over for each of the where clauses that we have set. So we set one right here, right? Templates.id is 1. We're going to create a column variable. For our column variable names, we're going to do colon, the column name, stripping out any periods that you might see inside of the where. Instead of templates.id, that is what it would look like over here. Once we have the column variable name, we can add it onto our SQL, where, the where type, the where column, and the column variable name, which we just defined right here. And then we add on to our execute params. Our column variable name here, our colon templates ID, is the array key, and the value is the actual value. Then in our runSelectQuery, after our build where, we have a build orderBy. We're going to initialize it to an empty array, loop over each of them, and add them onto our orderBy's array. OrderBy column and the direction. Ascending, descending. We can add them to our SQL by simply doing SQL orderBy and imploding them and comma separating them. Then we have our runQuery function. We've done all the SQL stuff we can do. Now we can run our query. Our run query function is going to be generic because we're going to also be doing deletes, inserts, and updates, and they're all going to actually come through our run query function. First thing we do is we prepare the SQL that we've created. After that, we set our fetch mode to a nice PDO fetch association array. We set the execute params. Then we're going to do an if else here. Check on what we want to get back. Depending on the fetch type you set, we set fetch multi. So we're going to be falling into here. You can do fetch all. Otherwise, we're just going to return the last ID. Once we got the result, we can initialize our database again, which is going to clear all the values and prepare the database for another database call. After we do that, we simply return the result. And that is our runSelectQuery function. The only thing I missed was that the type and the where needs to be an empty string by default, so you don't have to pass that in. Where type is like and or. Over in our model, I can dump out the template links, and if I refresh the page, we should see our links reading right from the database, because I put DB after everything in the database just so we know that it's different from the. Now that we have the template links passed back, I'm going to format them just a little bit so that they are just like our structure right up here that we were returning. We got our info and our links. We're going to loop over each of the template links, start the page info, set that to the current link, and we're going to append on the link to the page links, and then return the page. Refresh the page, we should see all of our DBs everywhere. Perfect, we're pulling from the DB, 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 DB. That's how you pull information out of the database with the framework. That's going to wrap up this video for creating a PHP model view controller, MVC for short framework, from scratch. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. I know I learned a lot from trying to build this framework myself. Like I said, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles of the major frameworks, but you know, it teaches you some basics and it gives you some idea of how these frameworks are built and how they're structured. Hit that subscribe button, leave a like, leave a comment down below, and let me know what you want to see coded up next. I'll catch you later.